Okay, everyone. I think people are going to start drifting in, but we don't want to waste our time. We've only got an hour here, so I'd like to get started. Welcome to the Saturday night plenary on the state of the humanities. We've already started this conversation a week before last in New York. So what you're going to hear tonight is the sort of second iteration of what we're thinking about. One of the things we want to think about tonight is how the landscape of humanities practice has changed and not changed in the past decade. By what measures might we chart the health and future of the humanities and the enterprises in the humanities that need support? In a stagnant academic job market, how do we account for nodes of resistance to humanities employment outside a traditional academic environment, from graduate mentors, from students, and from contingently employed faculty? How should universities rethink and take a leadership role in a 21st century humanities practice that exceeds the academy and conventional cultural institutions? This moderated conversation looks to a future in which the lines of a public and private humanities practice will not only be increasingly blurred, but will need to articulate their relevance to nonprofit and for-profit sectors beyond education. I want to welcome you here tonight. I'm Claire Potter. I'm a professor of history at the New School and the executive editor of Public Seminar, a web publication that you can find at publicseminar.org. To my right is Bro Adams, the former chair of the National Endowment of the Humanities and actually an old friend of mine, and now a senior fellow at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. To my left is Earl Lewis, also a friend of mine, slightly less old, currently president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation until March 2018, at which point he is going to rejoin the professoriate and create an entity called the Center for Social Solutions. And our format tonight is that I have sort of three broad questions that are going to structure our discussion here. We're going to spend 10 to 15 minutes on each question and reserve 20 minutes at the end for your questions. So as we're speaking, think about how you want to engage the panel on questions of urgent relevance to you. So to begin, Bro and Earl, the contemporary university. Is the university adapting to and promoting a new vision for academic work? What forms of evolution have we seen? And what limits to evolution are we encountering in the academy? Bro, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to give a shout out to friends from NEH who might be here. It's good to see you. And a lot of us are thinking a lot about you in this difficult, challenging time. But I know you'll keep the faith, as we will as well. When we talked about this first question earlier last week, we talked a lot about graduate education. And I would say, in terms of graduate education, the university, the contemporary university has been, in the humanities at least, has been extremely slow to change. And it's been a very difficult process of early change. Both NEH and Mellon have been involved in trying to stimulate changes in graduate education in the humanities. We've made some little bits of progress here and there, but I know from some visits that I've made this fall that those steps have been modest and they're hard. But I think we need to keep pushing on this frontier for reasons I think that are extremely obvious to everybody in this room. A graduate education in the humanities is under tremendous pressure. We're not going to see a return to the kind of job openings that we used to have. And we know that the students who are graduating from our PhD programs are going, in many cases, to different kinds of institutions than they might have otherwise, where teaching is much more fundamental and much more important as a part of the practice of being a part of those institutions. So we need to keep pushing hard on the graduate school agenda. We need to try to understand ways in which we can train students differently for different kinds of careers, not just in the academy, but outside the academy. If we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves faced with, I think, a situation in which we have no choice but to radically decrease the scope of those programs and the number of students we recruit to them. So we have to serve our students much better, I think, than we're doing in the humanities, in graduate education. And we have to advise undergraduates differently, I think, with respect to the careers they can expect to have if they're inclined to go to graduate school. So I hope that the good work that the AHA has done on this topic, and that the MLA is also doing, and NEH and Mellon as well, will continue and indeed accelerate, because I think it's a hugely important part of the future of the institution, and one of the greatest challenges that we face as a community.
Earl.
Good evening, everyone. Let me pick up on a few of the themes that Bro has begun to outline. If you think back over the last 25, 30 years, let's start indeed with graduate education. There have been at least 3 major reform efforts to try to reform aspects of graduate education. The Mellon Foundation itself was actually involved in one beginning in the mid-1990s. We spent $80 million and not a lot changed. And in fact, part of the focus there was actually to reduce time to degree. And certainly Ron Ehrenberg's book, along with Harry Zuckerman, will show that if that was the measure of success, then indeed we fail hopelessly and to reduce the time to degree. There were other modifications, however, that did occur in graduate education. And among them is actually it began even 20, 25 years ago. We began to ask a new set of questions about what it meant to pursue a doctorate in a variety of fields, and how we began to think about inside out. That is, for those who were actually engaging and deeply engaged in their scholarship, the degree to which they're speaking both to an academic community and a broad set of publics. And that request to speak to a broader set of publics has only intensified over the last 5 to 10 years, and I actually think it will continue to intensify. That's in part related to a broader set of questions about higher ed in general. There are those who still ask a new set of questions about what the academy is about. And in a world where one can talk about consumerism and the idea that you're buying a product, there is this great expectation that somehow a college degree is buying you something, and that will ensure you a certain both lifestyle and mobility later on. Our inability to actually extract ourselves from that larger conversation means then that we find ourselves having to answer questions that we may find at times uncomfortable to address. And so at Mellon, for instance, we are deeply committed to the liberal arts, but we also understand, if you ask people, what are the value of the liberal arts and how do we actually document this? We have fewer actually the body of evidence is not as thick and dense and full as one would imagine. And in a world where people would take us at face value a generation and a half ago or two, they no longer do. And so we then are required to begin to figure out, how do you analyze this? How do you document it? How do you present it? How do we understand it? So it's not just a black religion because we believe it. There's faith. We can say it, and if you say it long enough, you begin to believe it. In this city, I know that happens sometimes. But it's not true as a way going forward. So there's work there. Thankfully, if you look at things like the Humanities Indicators Project and a range of other sources that we have, I would say, and someone was asking me coming down the elevator, is there a good news story here? And I would say is that it's not a bad news story. That is, the humanities in a variety of ways actually have continued to be a thriving element of the academic life and the social and civic life in America, as measured by a variety of indicators. At the same time, there are new bodies of evidence that will have to be developed, and then we will have to figure out how do we begin to educate and train, and both educate and train for the next generation. And those are important questions that both the academic humanists and public humanists and a whole range of others will have to be engaged in, not individually, but collectively.
So, Earl, I want to pick up on that and throw another question out to both of you, because there is, of course, one program that Mellon is very famously associated with, which is the Mellon Mays Fellowship. And I had a number of students when I was at Wesleyan who did the Mellon Mays Fellowship. And just to pick a few examples, one of them is now running public housing for the city of New York, got a PhD, and is in charge of actually an important social justice project. A second one of those students got a PhD in history and is committed to going into administration to help transform higher education for students of color. Now, both of those seem like success stories to me, but often in the academy, if a person doesn't go on to a tenure-track job, that's not counted as a success story. So how do we account for the kind of continued resistance to PhDs going into a variety of jobs when, in fact, probably all of us can point to people with PhDs who are doing wonderful work in the world? Bro.
Well, I think the resistance comes from the fact that we've been engaged in certain educational graduate school practices for a very long time, and all of us were trained in a certain way. We were all trained in most of us in highly specialized fields. We were trained in a way that suggested to all of us in graduate school that we were going to go on to tenure track positions in colleges and universities across the country. And many of us expected that we'd be doing some teaching, but we'd be doing a huge amount of research. And the entire professoriate in the humanities is formed in that kind of image. And it's just not an image that's fitting the experience of our graduate students when they leave, and it's not going to fit better in the future. In fact, I think it will fit less well as time goes by. So it's a tough place to be in. I was at a couple of universities this last year talking to faculty about graduate education, and some of them say to me, we don't know how to train students for something else, and I understand that. But at the same time, if the world we knew is not the world we're going to have, we have to train ourselves differently to train them differently. Or, as I said before, I think there will be some very, very extreme consequences that none of us will like to see. So how do we do that? NEH had a program. I hope it will continue. I'm not sure about that, but it was a grant program to incentivize departments in colleges and universities, graduate programs, to begin to mentor students differently and ultimately to derive a different kind of curriculum for the world that's coming or the world that we already have. It's slow, hard work, and I had a lot of conversations, I won't mention where, but very good places about how difficult it was and how difficult it was for people to get on board. But we just don't have, I don't think, a reasonable choice. So we somehow have to internally find ways to think about this differently and to learn to mentor our students differently. And I think Earl's right that exploring the ways in which graduates of and in the humanities are flourishing in different professional contexts is extremely important. I don't think Rob will mind if I say the Humanities Indicators is about to come out with a brand new data set on humanities graduates in the workplace. It doesn't answer every question. I think it's a very good start, and Mellon is going to be engaged in this, as Earl said, as well. So we have a long way to go in understanding empirically what's happening, but we all know anecdotally that tremendously good things happen. I would just observe in my own experience with a PhD in the history of consciousness, whatever that is. You can imagine that wasn't the most in-demand PhD in the 1980s. So I had a career principally in university administration and then in government briefly, but I felt enormously well prepared to do those jobs. Higher education administration is a very interesting zone, and most really important jobs in higher ed do require a PhD. So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of opportunity in other places in the economy that we're just beginning to understand, and we need to turn the anecdotes into something stronger and more foundational in terms of how we change practices?
A large part of this, I think, has to do with how we actually measure success and where we start. And so I'll tell this little story. I was probably a second, third year associate professor at Michigan, and one of my doctoral students walked into my office one day, and she looked at me and she says, "Earl, when I grow up, I do not want to be you."
Little did she know.
Exactly. And at that moment, I had to stop and I go, "All right, Jamie, what do you mean?" And she had concluded from observing, she thought up close, and I would tell her later there were still things about me she didn't know, but she said, your life's not balanced, you don't do, and she went down a list, and she says, "That's not what I want to do." She went on, she earned her PhD, went on to get a master's in public health, and is now an administrator in a public health concern, a senior officer, in fact, in a public health concern. But in that conversation, we were allowed to then begin to talk about the other side of this, which is mentoring. And where, as a faculty member, I realized I was actually being mentored at the same time I was mentoring her. Because I was actually allowing myself to imagine that indeed there was a different way of talking about success. I would go on to be the dean of the graduate school at Michigan a few years later, and we began to sort of work on what do we mean by success. Now, you started with the MMUF. When I came to Mellon in 2013, those students were not part of our success story. For us, because the model had been that we wanted individuals who were going to earn their PhDs and go on and join the professoriate. And so there were a lot of MMUF students who actually went on to earn professional degrees, who were still deeply steeped in the knowledge of a particular field, but we didn't count them as success either. And so part of even then the funding agencies, and we being the prime example, had to step back and ask, what does success look like? Are these individuals who are making extraordinary contributions in particular domains with field-specific knowledge that improves the outcomes in those sectors, isn't that success? And how do we begin to then change the narrative and the vocabulary that we use? And so there was an internal question about leadership inside of the foundation. How do we then begin to lead by altering the narrative a little bit? And so now our numbers still talk about the professoriate, but we also begin to look for those others who are part of the MMUF program and what happened to them to be able to widen the story a little bit. And then I'll end with a final story that goes back to graduate life, where I can remember a colleague of mine when I was dean of the graduate school coming to me once and asking a question about why he should be supporting the student if the student was not going to go on and become a faculty member and part of his progeny. And I remember I said, well, I'm going to put it to you as crassly as I can. And he looked at me and said, "Okay, what are you up to now, Earl?" And I said, well, when you get older, do you imagine that you may one day want to have a chair? And he said, yeah. I said, which of your two students you think actually will be able to underwrite your chair? and who will have an understanding of why it is important to underwrite that chair at the same time. Yeah. And so part of actually beginning to think through this is also to think about how we need to see and enable people to be in many different domains, and that's a part of success as well. And I think that's for funders and also for those of us who have been in and out of the academy. So.
Well, when you mentioned underwriting that chair, there's been something on my mind ever since we began this conversation last week, which is, and I say this absolutely sincerely, I can't actually imagine anything more fulfilling than being in a position to give millions of dollars to people to forward intellectual projects. Yeah. I mean, I got a press release from NEH that said, $19.3 million to people, and it's making a huge difference. And you have to have a kind of knowledge and sophistication about what counts in order to do that. But let's get back to this question of success that you raise, Earl, which I think is very important, because part of what many of us hear from graduate students is that they have come to graduate school with a set of expectations that are not being met. At what point do we need to start creating a bigger menu for people? Is it in the undergraduate years? Do we need to be reaching out to high schools? How do we create an atmosphere in which people might know that getting a PhD, to go to work in a foundation, to become a college president, to facilitate the education of others, would actually be an excellent use of that PhD and of one's life?
Well, if students in undergraduate school are thinking about graduate education, we've got to be candid with them about the world that they're about to step into. And we can't use the old narrative about what that world will mean to them. So mentoring undergraduates as they get ready to go has to be conducted, I think, in a very different way. But we need to develop the language and the stories and the success scenarios that are both kind of anecdotal and kind of generally more statistical, if you will. So that's a very important part of that mentoring, but certainly the mentoring at the undergraduate level has to be very different. It's not unrelated to how we talk about to students about what it means to major in a humanities field, and indeed what liberal education is about. I think those two things are deeply and constantly connected. And so the narrative has to evolve and become more powerful and compelling at that level too, even as we have to keep the pressure on leaders, administrative leaders in higher education, political people, to remember that the educational process has got to be about more than just the economy, because it is and must be about more than that. But even as we make that argument, we have to do better at talking about the workplace consequences of liberal education and the workplace consequences or meaningfulness of humanities education.
Well,
my mind usually ends up in sort of two different camps here. I can see and have talked to those young people who are just excited about learning in a particular disciplinary field, and it's something about that that really jazzes them. And they get up and they will read more, they go to the library to engage in research projects, they'll look for internships, they'll work with community groups, and that's exciting. And you want to make sure that flame is always lit, because in some ways it's that ability to imagine yourself as a knowledge producer that is critical, in my view, to the sustaining of the democratic project that is America. And at the same time, then creating new structures and structures of opportunity within inside of the academy to bring new people in and make other kinds of possibilities. I mean, I've had over the years some students who came into through the undergraduate experience, came into the university, first generation, believing that they had a responsibility not only to themselves, but to their communities. And they could never shake that sense that they had this dual responsibility. And so to be able to then figure out the structures that allow them to actually tap that sense of responsibility and take it back, and where then universities could create community engagement opportunities that were real. And that actually where you sort of structure it so that by the time an individual is a senior as an undergraduate, his or her research project then builds upon the theory and the other work, and then they can take it back into the community. But where the community itself is not just a laboratory, but those folks too are co-partners in the whole research design, because in that way you begin to transform other parts of higher education. It is that, in my view, that split piece where we support the student who is jazzed by the subject, and we enable the student who is interested in the subject, but also wants to be attached to a different sense of communities, and in how we actually make both of those possible is, I think, key to the future of American higher education, more generally speaking.
So, Earl, I want to jump off of that, because basically what you're saying is that we need to think about a university and a humanities education that speaks to students where they are and that captures where they want to go and helps them do that. So how do we imagine teaching 10 years from now? I mean, how is teaching going to capture the kind of multivalent project that you're talking about?
Claire, as you know, I've been asking this question of anyone who's walked through the Mellon doors for the last 5 years. and have actually, it's the first time in my life where I've actually offered people money and have not had sufficient takers, where I said, if you were to redesign your curriculum
Right.
And you had a whiteboard exercise and you could do A, B, C, and D, and I would give you all the money in the world to do it, would you take it up? And so far, the answer has been no. And I leave in March. and so which means that I'll leave a little note for my successor. Here's a question to keep asking. And I say this in part because some of you will know, partly because Bro and I were joking, everything we do these days lives on YouTube, and so you end up going to give a talk someplace, and someone will see you later. I saw you at YouTube, so-and-so saying such and such. And so 2 of the 3 things I've said in those settings is that I think part of, particularly the humanities and history here is critical. There are important societal questions that require humanists to be involved in addressing those questions, but not just alone, in partnership. And so new kinds of interdisciplinary teams, I believe, will have to be constructed. And this is the case at the undergraduate and graduate level. And so Bro and I were together in New York at the MLA on Thursday in another group talking about the humanities and the future. And what I said there is I said, imagine, go back 2 years ago when the Obama administration talked about work on the brain and the ways in which we were going to invest millions of dollars to try to understand how the human brain works. And imagine if that team was only made up of folks from STEM and what kinds of things that we would learn. If we were only talking about neuroscientists and neurobiologists and physiologists, but imagine that team also had literary scholars on it and historians working on a similar question. And so I used them as an example there when I was at Emory and at Provost, we had acquired the papers of Salman Rushdie. And so we had all of Rushdie's papers, but we also had Rushdie's computers. And so we actually had been able to go back and retrieve all of the lost files down to each deletion. So we could begin to actually chart out the creative process. Think of the questions that a neuroscientist would ask, a neurobiologist may ask, a metadata expert may ask, a computer scientist may ask, a historian may ask, and a literary scholar. Now imagine that research team, not just of senior people, but of undergraduates and graduate students working together to try to figure out how do we begin to map the creative process of the individual who was claimed to have the Booker winners for the last quarter of the 20th century. Think about what that, and so for me, it is those new ways of thinking about old questions with new configurations of individuals coming together. And it requires us then in the academy to also begin to think about, okay, so how do we judge and evaluate for tenure? I mean, is it a book? Is it an article? I mean, is it a series of articles? Is it a blog? Is it something else that begins to sort of say, here's how information is developed. Here's how we think about scholarly communication in the next 10 to 20 years. Are we comfortable abandoning some of the hierarchies of privilege and power that have governed us for the last 100 years? Those are the fundamental questions, because if we don't get to those questions, we'll never get to the change that some of us think we should actually be all about.
So, Earl, you're talking about what many of us call breaking down the silos, right? And we're sort of looking out at a room full of historians who were trained in discipline and are training their students in discipline. And I want to turn to Bro with this, because, of course, Bro, you were president of a liberal arts college where perhaps the opportunities for breaking down those silos were greater, or perhaps they weren't. And how can you speak to that? What would a place like Colby look like in 10 years to really meet the challenges Earl's talking about?
It would depend on how much money Earl gave me to change it.
Well, he has to
we
go
can
through
talk
me
later.
first, so I take my piece.
And in some ways, a place like Colby or any liberal arts college is easier to imagine these kinds of changes because they're smaller, they're more student-intensive places. But even at those kinds of places, in my experience, the model of graduate education that we've been accustomed to, with disciplinary specialization and subdisciplinary specialization, where graduate students come out of graduate school expecting to do a very particular kind of work, very particular kind of research, and a very particular kind of teaching. So in the undergraduate curriculum at a place like Colby, we imitated the graduate curriculum. Right? You have a literature program that's divided up by by periodization, or sub-disciplinary specializations of various kinds, similar to the disciplinary subspecializations in history. And the system reproduces itself in those ways. So these young, very energetic, very well-educated graduate students want to do what they've been trained to do. And it's very difficult to change the curriculum departmentally, where most of the power lies, right? Because that's the way we've defined the curriculum, as a set of disciplinary curricula, basically. I think we have to break that model. We have to get away from the undergraduate curriculum being a pale imitation of the graduate curriculum. And as Earl suggested, we have to reach out into new kinds of two things. One, new kinds of connectivity with what's happening around us in the world. Mm-hmm. And secondly, new kinds of pedagogy that are appropriate to that. I was telling a former colleague from NEH the other day that I've been reading Stanley Cavell's beautiful memoir, Little Did I Know. And he recounts in great detail the agony of his early teaching at Berkeley, where he was preparing, 60, 80 lectures a year, these sort of command performances that were all one-way kind of engagements, though if there's anybody you want to listen to for an hour, it's Stanley Cavell. But in any case, we're in a very different place now, pedagogically, and we've got to use all of this new energy and these new expectations that students really have to change the pedagogy still further and to re-scramble the curriculum in ways that do not simply reproduce the graduate school curriculum. Earl mentioned integration. Some of you know that the Academy, American Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine is about to come out. I don't think it's come out yet, with the new report on integration between the humanities and the sciences and the arts. I look forward to seeing it. I haven't seen it. Mellon funded it and NEH funded it during my time. But those are the kinds of things that we need to now push, and we need to break up those old forms and engage in new curricular forms, subject matter forms, pedagogical forms, because that's where all of this has to head.
Great. So both of you, in your different ways, through the different entities that you've worked for, have really put a lot of energy behind digital humanities practice and public humanities practice, which, encourages the kinds of collaborations Earl is talking about, that encourage the training of students for a 21st century world where actually they're going to be living digitally, are living digitally, need a certain kind of digital literacy. I'd like to speak to both of you about how well you think the funding efforts for digital humanities and public humanities have succeeded, and where you'd like to see it go next. Earl.
We have spent a lot of money at the Mellon Foundation supporting the digital humanities, and I actually think it's been important to do so. But I also, one with deep questions about where we are. And so I keep asking internally a very simple question. And it goes back to curriculum. If we're talking about the digital humanities, can we distinguish between a 100-level course, an upper division course, and something at the graduate level? Do we actually have a curriculum? Or do we actually have a set of tools that are applied by individuals to advance their own body of research and knowledge? I mean, it's fine to say if the answer to that question is yes, that's all we have. But I think then 2.0 means then if it's actually going to be moved beyond just being a suite of tools that can be used, And then we have to come and ask, what is it? What's the basic knowledge that any undergraduate in the first or second year should have to be conversant with the digital tools and their application in the humanities? How do we think about that? And should that be the same thing as by the time an individual gets to his or her senior year? And then should a graduate level course then look in some ways different from that first year, second year undergraduate course and a upper division course? There are beginnings of pieces at individual places, but they're still not at a national level, at least from where we from what we can infer at Mellon, an agreement about the codification of this process. And I actually worry that failing to do so and being attentive to the need to do so means that we'll look back in 10 and 15 years and say, oh boy, we missed an opportunity. And from those of us who are funders and who are asked by our boards, okay, so what's the theory of change here that's underlying your work and commitment of millions of dollars to X or Y or Z? We need to be able to answer that question not only with case studies of 1, 2, or 3, but some example of actually what is happening and what can be scaled.
Bro.
One of the great pleasures in the experience of being at NEH was learning about the digital humanities in a pretty deep way. I think NEH has been exemplary with Mellon in leading that sort of evolution, the application of digital resources to humanities issues. Most of the gain that I understand has been in humanities research, and I think the gains there have been extraordinary. Is every path productive? Not necessarily, but the experimentation has been, I think, incredibly interesting and important. And so I think it will continue, and I think it will get better and better and more significant. The thing that I hope we do as humanists is reverse the arrow and not just use digital technology to advance our own work, but use our humanities-based skills to understand what's happening in the world around and because of this incredible technology, which is in every part of our lives. And very few people are better suited to understand this than humanists, because it comes down to the ways in which this technology is inflecting our experience, our social relations, our political relations, as we know. So I think there's a hugely important public humanities question here, and I think it's an enormously important question for historians, and virtually every other part of the humanities. Certainly philosophers are very interested in this now, but again, I think we still have a long way to go before we equalize the energy that we're expressing in the digital humanities to thinking as much about what the digital means as thinking about how to use it for our own important purposes.
So should we actually be turning humanities education and scholarship in the humanities toward more decisively public questions? I mean, we're at a moment in 2018 that could reasonably be described as a political crisis and a cultural crisis, which, as you say, Bro, you know, the humanities are in fact designed to address. Is this an opportunity to say, we're actually going to move aggressively to put the humanities to public use?
Clearly, I hope so, is the answer, and there is compelling reason for doing so. So I sat through a private meeting a few weeks ago at the Ford Foundation where a researcher shared some of his data. They had gotten access to Facebook, and they had been able, in looking at the Facebook data, and they had gone into electoral districts in Wisconsin and a few other pivotal states from the last year's election. And they were interested in how various positions were presented on Facebook. And so in these two communities they looked at, or 2 or 3 communities they looked at, and they were looking at the Blue Lives Matters tweets and comments and the Black Lives Matters comments. And they came to find out that actually most of those comments actually were being generated by bots. And that somewhere, and they can actually trace these bots to IP addresses in Russia, but they came to understand, here's the position of the humanists, there's someone there. The bots themselves didn't create this. There's somebody who understood something about the history of race and conflict in American life, and understood how to actually set this up in such a way as to create antagonisms in particular communities because of who they were and how they were peopled over a period of time. And this is the kind of analysis that becomes critically important in the public domain, that it looks like that something has happened naturally. No, it's not. But there are human agents working with digital agents to create a new set of possibilities and realities. Our job then comes back to actually interpret that and to understand why and how somebody someplace else knew enough about antagonisms in Milwaukee to believe that posting and using bots to talk about Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter would actually create new kinds of tensions on the ground in an election season.
Okay, as Bro is also responding to this question, I want to invite the audience to begin to line up at this microphone to come into the conversation, and just say when we begin, when you ask your question, please say who you are, if you would. So you can begin to come up to the microphone now as Bro is responding to this last
I'll be very
prompt.
brief because I'd like to hear people's thoughts. The answer for me is emphatically yes. The public humanities, or the public questions that the humanities can address, are hugely important, and we need to engage them more predictably and often in our teaching and research. Two quick anecdotes on this. One somewhat intentionally provocative. When Charlottesville happened, I felt inadequate to the moment in terms of my own understanding of the history of monuments and all of the associated issues. So I did what any smart person would do. I called Jim Grossman, and I said, educate me. And so he gave me some reading, which led to some other reason. David Blight's great book and some other things. But it's a great example of how, if you don't understand the history of this question, you can't understand the event. It's not possible. Now, there are a lot of people in the country who don't care or want to know that, but still, we as humanists and as historians have to make that case. And there are many, many, many kinds of issues like that that are so ripe for our work. That's the great news about our current situation. There's so much to talk about that's fundamentally about the humanities, and as Earl says, that really is interpretive in its essence. The second thing, I was at a conference in Wales last fall, the Association for the Evaluation of Science, of the social impact of science, which was dealing in this conference particularly with the humanities and social sciences. And I was stunned, because I come from a very different context, to see that in England, in France, in Germany, all of the funding organizations are now demanding accounts of the public impact of the research that's being funded. For them, this is a huge deal, because most of the money, unlike here, comes from these state organizations. What it leads to is a conversation, sometimes resented, but pretty interesting, among these national organizations about just what questions researchers ought to be approaching. If you translate that into the United States and you think, what would it mean for the AHA to say, this year we think we want to inspire, energize, pick your number, these 10 topics, and somehow encourage and support scholars in doing that. What if NEH did that? What if MLA did that? What if Mellon did that? Now, I know that will drive a lot of people crazy, but because a national research agenda is just such an anathema in some way to us. But I think it's a very interesting thing to think about and to talk about. What are the 5 or 6 key questions that some decent number of historians should be thinking about in this time.
Actually, I think that's amazing. So, audience, let's bring you in. We have a microphone over there, and we have a microphone up here. And as I said, please say your name when you ask your question. If you want to ask it of a specific panel member, that's fine. Otherwise, both of our panelists will answer it. Yes?
My name's Rod Walton, and my question is on the one of the topic, the state of the humanities. And each one of us, I guess, are sort of buried with our own university, our own college, and the problems that we have. Maybe dual enrollment is a problem or something like that. I wondered if either of you or both of you could give an overview of the problems seen by the humanities as a whole, not only the job market, what's the issue with state funding for public universities, is the problems, the issues with de-emphasizing history and the humanities in favor of STEM?
Go ahead,
It's a
Earl.
huge question.
We will tag team on this. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we face is trying to figure out what we know and what we don't know. And that's why I started out by actually referencing the Humanities Indicators Project, and Bro echoed that later on. There are data there that would suggest that if you plot this over the last 10 years, you get one pattern. If you go over the last 50 to 60 years, you'll actually see some variations in a theme, and that actually both in terms of funding and state support, there have been highs and lows. This is actually not the lowest period. If you measure it in terms of students who are majoring, it can vary greatly by institution. I mean, I've had people, certainly at the foundation, to come in and say, this is true of this pattern, but not at our place because there are other kinds of patterns. We know at the Mellon Foundation, for instance, we started a new emphasis a couple of years ago where we're now connecting two-year institutions to four-year institutions. We know that upwards of 40% of the students who graduated in humanities over the last 7 to 8 years have started at two-year institutions. This is suggesting that as there's been a downturn in those native students who are majoring in humanities, and they have been replaced by their brothers and sisters who are coming in from the outside. So that's one pattern that has led us to question whether or not we should have an 8, 9, 10 region approach or a 50-state approach. That connects not in the old way of articulation agreements, but really new kinds of relationships between two-year institutions and four-year institutions, moving not just students from one to the other, but actually creating new kind of linkages between faculty at the four-year institutions and the two-year institutions. If you look at other kinds of national patterns and practices, then I would say one last thing. At the state level, and this is with all kind of variation, there was a report that was put out a year ago by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as part of the Lincoln Project, and that begins to look at the decline in state support, particularly for public institutions. But that's linked to a larger set of priority-setting claims that I argue emerged in the 1970s and intensified in the 80s and the 90s, and now we'll see in the dividends in the 2000s. And that goes back to the degree to which taxation can be used as a vehicle for providing more support for the common good. That's a much larger question than even support directly for the humanities, but it goes strictly to the question of how and in what ways we actually want to see investments in higher education. And the Lincoln Project went so far as to say that we can repatriate some of those dollars that have been being held offshore in corporate accounts, and maybe one of the ways best put to use is actually to assist in really closing the gap in the higher ed side. These are larger questions that I think we will have to face, but those are some general patterns. I mean, otherwise we could be here all night. I'm sure Bro has his own thread here to connect to what I had to say.
Well, just to extend the thought on community colleges, the only place in the country, or higher ed, where the concentrations in the humanities are growing is in the community college sector. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and we could talk about that, but that's interesting and impressive. NEH started to re-energize its community college work because of that, and so has Mellon. As the humanities indicators work shows, there are continuing downward pressures across the country, notwithstanding the variations all over the place, in humanities enrollments and concentrations. That's pretty universal. The other thing that I discovered in meeting with lots of big public institutions when I was at NEH was the migration of the cost accounting of big universities into very particular forms of cost accounting that are basically measuring seats in chairs and the allocation of resources, not on the basis of a kind of a broad educational philosophy and a curricular commitment to liberal learning, for example, but rather in terms of who's showing up, how many people show up in different places. This puts enormous pressure on administrators, and it's very difficult for them to cope with this, notwithstanding their beliefs. And I found most of them quite sympathetic to the arguments for liberal learning and therefore the humanities and things outside of the question of work readiness in a narrow sense. So, making that case for a broad education that's preparing people for, not just for work readiness, but for, as Earl said, community engagement readiness, participation readiness, life existential readiness, all of those things we know that are important as life goes on. That's becoming increasingly more difficult. And that's what we really have to turn around if we're going to turn around some of these fundamental trends. As I say, there's tremendous variation around the country, and different institutions experience this in different ways. But I think the general sensation that I have is that. The other one we've talked about already is graduate education, where there is continuing pressure on graduate education, on placement of people in teaching positions, going back to all of the things that we talked about.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, from what you're saying, Bro, too, I mean, I would sort of underline, we currently have a president who it is said does not read at all. So what does it actually mean to imagine a country where people are not reading throughout their lifetime and caring about what they read? We have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Nathaniel Green. I teach history at Northern Virginia Community College, right across the river here. And most of the students that I teach in my survey courses, that's what I teach over there, are not history majors. One of the things that I wanted to do is ask you about sort of how do we expand this discussion even further beyond not just graduate students in history or prospective graduate students or prospective majors in the humanities, but also how do we sort of change our curriculum to speak to students who enter our classes who are taking the class because they have to fulfill a degree requirement, but I want to be an accountant, or I'm doing IT, or I'm doing this and that, and they perceive no connection between what they want to study and what they're sort of being forced to sit in my class. And one of the things that I really try to do is to demonstrate how everything has a history, and history and the humanities are connected to everything. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, how we can do that, and the importance of that endeavor, because that seems to be really a huge key here, not just for history majors, but sort of for people outside of those fields. How do we demonstrate the relevance, not only the economic relevance, but as you said, the sort of cultural, existential relevance of it all?
Earl?
Sure. I love these questions because I realized we could spend the whole rest of the evening sort of trying to probe through the various elements. I mean, one thing I would observe, and as you were talking, and I had a flashback moment to the early 1980s, and I think I met some of those same students then too, who were taking an introductory survey course, and they were required to be there, and they told me so. And then we proceeded to have a conversation about what I was expected from them and what they could expect from me. And I think part of our job as educators is to remind them that indeed that we do have a job, and that job is to introduce them to subjects and ways of learning that they may not know at this time will be valuable to them at some later point in time. And not every one of them will get it. And so the question becomes, can you design a classroom in a manner that allows as many of them to actually own some part of that classroom? Because what I've learned, and I think much of the research has shown, the degree to which the students themselves become active learners in both the design and the implementation of the classroom increases the likelihood that they make connections that they would not have made at the outset. And so trying to figure out how you do that with your students who most likely are working 20 to 40 hours a week somewhere else, and for whom coming into your class, and if you have 500 pages and they go, oh my God, I haven't read this much ever, and I can't figure out why I need to read this much, and what is it going to do for me anyway, because I'm going to become an accountant or I'm going to do something else. And part of your challenge is to say, you know, and little examples will say, okay, you want to be an accountant, but is that all you want to be? If you look at the data on future work, many of the jobs that we're talking about now will become obsolete, including accounting. And so what are you going to do 15 years from now? If and indeed we can actually come up with an algorithm that will deal with profit and loss margins and a whole range of things faster than you could ever do in an Excel spreadsheet. How do you begin to think about not next year, but 10 to 15 to 20 years from now? And what is it about the past that may actually help you to think in a new way about your own future? Those are the kinds of questions that have been introduced in different ways and in different places. It's not a cure-all, and the beauty of a classroom is that you have 30, 40, 50 unique individuals with their own histories.
I have such respect for the work you do, and I'd be very reluctant to give you advice. The work that's being done in community colleges is so impressive. And you know, most students in the United States are in the community college sector. So it's a hugely important work that you're doing. In one respect, it may not be so different from other places in that even at a liberal arts college, I found myself saying a lot, every faculty person has to imagine themselves teaching every student, not just the students that are going to be history majors or philosophy majors or literature majors. So you have that problem or challenge all the time, right? That is your challenge. But these connective tissues to community life, where these students are coming from in ways that some of us in other institutions just don't experience, you know, that's the anchor, it seems to me. And being persuasive about their obligations and lives as citizens. There's so many new Americans in the community college sector, and making sure that we do right by them as new citizens is just an incredibly important task.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questioners here, and our time is basically up. So I wonder if I could ask each of you to ask your question, and then we could sort of have a quick roundup here, if the rest of the group could give us 2 or 3 more minutes. So if you would ask your question and you would ask your question, that would be great.
Martin Halbert, great to see you again, Earl. I'm now in the UNC system, but I was at Emory and overlapped with you, and I was reminded of those days when we brought in that Rushdie archive, and it's a great example of that collision of the kind of the very traditional mindset of historical archives work and new things that we have to struggle with. And you know, I vividly remember a conversation that was a real conversation when those laptops first came in of, you know, well, how are we going to preserve that stuff? And, you know, there was a serious proposal to just print everything off the laptops and, you know, redact the information with mark slots off it. And And that was the end of it. But, we struggled with, well, that can't be the end of it. We really want to preserve, we want to take a new approach to thinking about the historical record as represented in those laptops, and how do you preserve that, and how do you study that in a historical method, and not simply in a project mode, but in the same way, same ongoing way that archives study things over long periods of time. And I celebrate the work of the foundation in supporting those kinds of transformative efforts, but it's just there is still a tremendous legacy, as you're highlighting, of those more traditional approaches that has to be transcended in these projects. So less I don't know if there's a question there than just a affirmation of the challenges that you've highlighted.
Thank you so much. And then our last question.
Yes,
here.
sorry, okay. My name is Juliana Richardson. I'll stand back here. I've got a loud voice, but I want to ask my question but make a statement. So my question is, what would it take for those who are humanists or in the humanities to have a large, bold vision? Because this evening I feel like I'm at a funeral. And I want to say this as someone who studied American Studies at Brandeis before going on to Harvard Law School and graduating, where most of the people there were trained in the humanities, because if you're going to go to law school, you have to, for the most part, come with a humanities background. And Earl knows very much my project, which has grown to be the nation's largest African-American video oral history archive, housed at the Library of Congress. It's called the History Makers, but obviously, even after all that law school training, it was my humanities background that prevailed to what I'm doing right now. And I say this also because I've spent a lot of time in the STEM community, and I know that they have significant funding from the Department of Defense and the government. But from them, I learned about people who felt, some at one point have felt many times endangered, but also have often had a bold vision of themselves. And I say this also because I can't imagine a world without people in the humanities. I can't imagine a world with the president we have, where we will not be able to have a civil society or educated society. So with all of that, I ask you the question of what will it take for people here to have a bold vision, and to also have, we can talk about digital humanities and we can talk about public humanities. My project fits at the intersection between both of those. But if their vision is singularly that one track is the only track, then how can you talk about bold? Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to play my role as Judy Woodruff at the NewsHour and say to both of my guests here, in a couple of sentences, how do you respond to that challenging question? Earl?
You support the things, you support the individuals who themselves actually have a bold vision. I mean, I think in the end, communities don't have visions. Actually, it's individuals who actually rally others to have visions. And so, I mean, Juliana and I have these debates when she knows my take on this, and that's why I support people and have gone on, because here's what I would say, and Juliana, we can have a drink about this a little later and talk about it, but if you're waiting for a community and you're going through a community process to actually come up with a vision, it may take a lifetime. But if you have individuals who are willing to take the lead and actually then rally others to that vision to move forward, you can get it done in a lifetime. And so it's the difference between what you're waiting for and what you actually are willing to take on. Though and I'll say it this way because for the Mellon Foundation has long believed that it was forward-looking. We came to realize over the last few years we needed to be outward-facing. That's part of that shift in vision, to begin to actually look at what it means to be outward-facing. That was not a community or a group. It was an individual or two who began to shift priorities and make it happen. It can be done. It's a complicated answer to a very, very complicated question. And as you know, while I go to funerals, I actually don't believe in the funeral side of the humanities. I don't believe we're in the doldrums, but I do believe there's an opportunity to actually imagine that next chapter.
Okay, Bro, you get the last word.
Well, that's intimidating. Thank you for the good question and the challenge it contains. As I said before, the good news is that the humanities have never been more relevant to public life and to living a human and humane life than they are now. Our challenge as scholars and advocates is to make that case publicly about relevance in ways that are compelling to the audiences we need to persuade, and also to, in our own work, in our own institutions, insist upon the continuing importance of this, what used to be called the education of the whole person, right? The significance of a broad education for the challenges that we have as a country and as a world now. And as I said, in some ways, it's never been clearer. When you think about what's going on globally, when you think about what's going on domestically, the integration of those two frontiers or zones, which has never been more pressing than it is now. So we have a lot to talk about, and we have a lot of promising things to say. We need to be mobilizing ourselves in new and more compelling ways to say them.
Thank you, and thank you, Bro. Thank you, Earl, not just for this conversation, but for the work you've done and for the work you will do, supporting all of us. And thank you very much to the audience for being with us tonight and for these wonderful questions.